Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Of the 4 essays that Hume authored, titling them with particular philosophical schools, the Epicurean, the Stoic, the Platonist, and the Skeptic, the last one is by far the longest, and it doesn't have a subtitle the way that the other preceding 3 do, and it's in part because, I will say, it doesn't really need one because it actually represents David Hume's own position. You wouldn't get everything, every idea from Hume's philosophy in this particular essay, but you're actually getting quite a few, certainly with respect to his appreciation for the variability of human perspectives and his interest in where this actually arises from. So he begins by talking about a suspicion with regard to the decisions of philosophers on all subjects, and found in myself a greater inclination to dispute than assent to their conclusion. And then he generalizes and says there's one mistake to which they seem liable almost without exception, and it's a generalizing on their part that is the mistake. They confine too much with their principles and make no account of the vast variety which nature has so much affected in all our operations. When a philosopher has once laid hold of a favorite principle, right? So some explanatory idea, what do? They extend the same principle over the whole creation and reduce it to every phenomenon, though by the most violent and absurd reasoning. And so he says, this is understandable. We can't really understand the whole variety and extent of nature. And we think that when we've got hold of part of it, we're grasping the totality. And then he goes on and he says, if ever this infirmity of philosophers is to be suspected, it's in reasonings concerning human life and the methods of attaining happiness, because they've got a double problem. So there's a narrowness of understanding. We don't really understand the universe, and we are part of that universe. But we're also misled, as he says, by our passions, meaning our entire affective life. We could say the world of appreciating value, not just facts. And he says that almost everyone has a predominant inclination to which his other desires and affections submit, and which governs him, though perhaps with some intervals through the whole of his life. And it's difficult for him to apprehend that anything which appears totally indifferent to him can ever give enjoyment to any person and possess charms, right? The objects of his passion are the most valuable, and the road which he pursues is the only one that leads to happiness. But if we look at human beings and we get away from our own limited perspective for just a bit, what do we actually observe? He talks about seeing a vast variety of inclinations and pursuits among human beings. And so, he says that we don't feel the same thing as our neighbor does. And he gives you a bunch of examples. Do they not feel in themselves what pleases at one time displeases at another by the change in inclination? What is the meaning of those general preferences of the town or the country life, or a life of action or one of pleasure, of retirement or society, right? And so he says, well, what should we do about this? Should a person only consult their own humor and inclinations, or should they look at the variety of different options for themselves? And Hume says, well, you need to figure out what is it that you actually do value and desire. He says, one man following his inclination and choosing his course of life may employ much surer means for succeeding than another who's led by his inclination to the same course of life. And we can come up with what he calls maxims of common prudence for this. So here's an example of those maxims. Are you interested in riches? Well, acquire skill in your profession. Be diligent in the exercise of it. Enlarge the circle of your friends and acquaintance. Avoid pleasure and expense. And never be generous, but with a view of gaining more than you would save by frugality. And he gives similar advice for acquiring public esteem. All of these are ways in which people can, get what they want if they're thoughtful about it. And then Hume is going to broaden this discussion to a very general principle, what he calls certain and undoubted principle that we can learn from philosophy. And what is it? There is nothing in itself valuable or despicable, desirable or hateful, beautiful or deformed. Now notice with each of these we have a pair of opposites. We have a contrasting set of judgments that can be made, and these are all affective terms. Valuable or despicable, desirable or hateful, beautiful or deformed. What do these arise from, then? He says that these arise from the particular constitution, so the way a person's put together, we say, and fabric of human sentiment and affection. And so, he says what one animal thinks is delicious food, another finds loathsome. And if we go down further, we get a really funny example, which I think all of us can relate to. Perhaps we've been on one side or the other. Desire this passionate lover to give you a character of his mistress. He will tell you he's at loss for words to describe her charms, and will ask you very seriously if you were ever acquainted with a goddess or an angel. If you answer you never were, he will say, it's impossible for you to form a conception of such divine beauties as those which his charmer possesses. So complete a shape, such well-proportioned features, so engaging an air, such sweetness of disposition, such gaiety of humor. So he's making a case, right? He's saying, here is what is so wonderful about my beloved. This is why I feel this great attraction for her. And you look at her and you're like, I don't see it, man. Good for you, but not good for me. Well, what's going on? He says, you can infer nothing but that the poor man is in love, and the general appetite between the sexes is determined to a particular object by some qualities which give him pleasure. And then he talks about another great example, infants, right? Each animal species brings forth its own infants and thinks of them in wonderful ways. Oh, it's so good. And we look at them and we're like, oh, they're ugly. I mean, even with humans, right? Human babies, if it's not your baby, you might be like, looks like a shaved ape. What an ugly thing, right? So all of this, he says, has to do with something that we can draw more conclusions about. He says we can conclude even when the mind operates alone, feeling the sentiment of blame or approbation, so saying good or bad, right? Pronounces one object deformed and odious, another beautiful and amiable. The qualities are not in the objects themselves. Where are they then? They belong to the sentiment of that mind which blames or praises. And he says, okay, this may be a tough argument to make to negligent thinkers, but there is taste. We have a faculty that decides on that. And there's a considerable diversity in these sentiments. Education, custom, prejudice, caprice, and humor will vary our tastes. And you can even just take the same person whose tastes might change from one period of their life to another. So it's really the sentiment of the mind that is determining these sorts of things. So he says, let's draw a distinction here. When we're thinking about what we might call matters of fact, things that have to do with, say, the sciences, where we're just regarding matters in a dispassionate way, he says, in the operation of reasoning, the mind does nothing but run over its objects as they're supposed to stand in reality without adding anything to them. So I can have like live debates about things. Is the Ptolemaic or the Copernican understanding of the solar system the right one? Okay, I don't have to get myself affectively involved in that. I can just ask what's the real situation of the planets. But when it comes to all sorts of other designators, let's call them, or judgments, he says the qualities of beautiful and deformed, desirable and odious, it's not the same as with truth and falsehood. Why? In the former case, the mind is not content with merely surveying the objects as they stand in themselves. It also feels a kind of sentiment, right? What kind of sentiment? He says delight or uneasiness. It feels good or feels bad about these. Approbation, saying good things, or blame, criticizing them. And that sentiment determines it to use words which express certain judgments. What kind of judgments? Well, beautiful or deformed, desirable or odious. And what does this actually depend upon? He says the particular fabric or structure of the mind, which enables particular forms to operate in such a particular manner and produces a sympathy or conformity between the mind and its objects. Vary the structure of the mind or inward organs, and the sentiment no longer follows, right? So the sentiment is what we should be paying most attention to, not just the object. And he says the conclusion everyone is able to draw of himself without much philosophy, where the sentiment is evidently distinguishable from the object. And he gives some examples here. We'll just take one of them, vengeance. It's not desirable in itself. It's desirable because of the structure of human passions. Maybe you're angry about something or envious about something. So we have significant differences between human beings. And where are these going to come from? So he's going to tell us all the difference between one person and another with regard to life consists in one thing or another, either the passion or in the enjoyment. So he says, if we get these wrong, we can be miserable. If we get these right, we can be happy. So he says, to be happy, the passion must neither be too violent or too remiss, meaning the opposite of violent, too calm. To be happy, the passion must also be benign and social, not rough or fierce. And the passion must be cheerful and gay, not gloomy and melancholy. So, three guidelines. Now, is Hume right about these? Well, we don't have to worry about that. That's his point of view. Then he goes on and says some passions or inclinations in the enjoyment of their object are not so steady or constant as others. So, for example, philosophical devotion he talks about. Now, that's referring to the Platonist, right? Contemplation. Hume, this is a bit of a side note, you get this from his treatise and his inquiry concerning human understanding. Hume thinks that we can't really do philosophy in a sustained way for more than a little while. As soon as we leave our study and enter the billiard room, to use one of his examples, all of these worries about philosophical topics kind of go out of our minds because we're now engaged in life. So maybe we can't enjoy philosophical devotion all that much, but maybe we can enjoy other things as well. And so here's where we get some interesting questions about, well, how do these things contribute to happiness? And he considers pleasure and he considers virtue as things that we could value and pursue, right? Virtue's probably going to be better, but he also says a lot of this is not up to us all that much. He tells us that most human beings are going to be guided by what he calls constitution and temper, and general maxims have little influence, except insofar as they affect our taste or sentiment. So if a person, for example, has a lively sense of honor and virtue with moderate passions, their conduct will be conformable to the rules of morality. If he departs from it, his return will be easy and expeditious. That person is kind of lucky in a way. On the other hand, when you're born so perverse a frame of mind, so callous and insensible a disposition, as to have no relish for virtue and sympathy, humanity, no sympathy with his fellow creatures, no desire of esteem and applause, such a one must be allowed entirely incurable, and philosophy can't do anything about that kind of person. So we have our constitution, our temper, you could call it temperament or personality, and we can use general maxims, but it's going to require that they get some sort of traction with us, and they might not get the same traction with us as they do with other people. And, Hume says that's just the way things are. There are some things that we can do, right? He says that a serious attention to the sciences and liberal arts does soften and humanize the temper and cherishes those fine emotions in which true virtue and honor consist. So, this is part of why we tend to think of education as a good thing for a person. It's formation. Philosophy can help to some degree. But how do they do this? Here's where we get to another really important principle for David Hume, right? He says that besides such insensible changes on the temper and disposition, it's highly probable others may be produced by study and application, right? But how do we do that? Habit, he says. Habit is another powerful means of reforming the mind and implanting in it good dispositions and inclinations. A man who continues in a course of sobriety and temperance will hate riot and disorder. If he engage in business or study, indolence will seem a punishment to him. If he constrain himself to practice beneficence and affability, he will abhor all instances of pride and violence. So without focusing on habit, we're not really going to make that much progress. And he says, here is the chief triumphant art of philosophy. It refines the temper and it points out to us those dispositions which we should endeavor to attain. How? By a constant bent of mind and by repeated habit. And Hume says, if you don't do this, you're really not going to change the person. And he's going to give a lot of examples of, principles that might not work that well for people other than the philosopher who puts them forward. And he kind of makes fun of what he calls the artificial arguments of a Seneca or an Epictetus. These are the Stoic philosophers. A bit later, he's going to make fun of Cicero, who consoles people for deafness, saying, there's a lot of languages you don't understand. Now you just don't understand one other one, your particular language. And he says, I like better the repartee of Antipater the Cyrenaic, when some women were condoling with him for his blindness. What? Says he, do you not think there are no pleasures in the dark? Right. So and he gives a bunch of other examples that are kind of interesting, which you can check out. And then towards the end, he's going to talk about two considerations to be met with in books of philosophy from which any important effect is to be expected. Why? Because these are drawn from common life and occur on the most superficial view of human affairs. So in essence, he's saying these should work for most people. So one of these is to think about the shortness of our life, the uncertainty of it, how despicable seem all our pursuits of happiness, right? If we extend our concern beyond our own life, how frivolous appear our most enlarged and most generous projects when we consider the incessant changes and revolutions of human affairs, by which laws and learning, books and governments are hurried away by time and lost in the immense ocean of matter. He says such a reflection certainly tends to mortify all of our passions, right? But there's a danger to this. So what is he saying there? We think about the relativity of the value of things that we think actually are valuable. Now, that could lead us to be more judicious, could also lead us to be more lascivious, we might say, right? He says that may not such a reflection be employed with success by voluptuous pleasure-seeking reasoners in order to lead us from the paths of action and virtue into flowery fields of indolence and pleasure, right? So that could be a problem. The second idea is that of making comparisons. Hume says we can look at our own condition and compare that with others. We're already always doing this anyway, so we can do it in a better way. The philosopher, instead of comparing our current status with those who are better off or superior to us, is going to look at the vast majority of humankind who are probably worse off than us. So he says that if you do this, then you can get a sense of perspective, but there can be a problem with this as well. He says maybe this will produce sorrow rather than comfort and add to his lamentations for his own misfortunes a deep compassion to that of others. But, these things are what they are. And he's going to conclude this. He says, although virtue is undoubtedly the best choice, such is the disorder and confusion of human affairs that no perfect or regular distribution of happiness and misery is ever in this life to be expected. The body, the world, our makeup, these are, for the most part, things out of our control. We can take some measure of control over them, but, there's only so much we can do. And he says, towards the very end, in a word, human life is more governed by fortune than by reason. And shall we engage ourselves in it with passion and anxiety? It's not worthy of so much concern. Shall we be indifferent about what happens? Well, if we do that, we lose all the pleasure of the game. While we're reasoning concerning life, life is gone. And death, though perhaps they receive him differently, treats alike the fool and the philosopher. And he says, even to reason so carefully concerning life and to fix with accuracy its just idea would be overvaluing it, were it not that to some tempers this occupation is one of the most amusing in which life could possibly be employed. And I think that actually does describe Hume as well. So the Skeptic, his conclusion to these 4 essays on the different philosophical schools, temperaments, ways of living, he is essentially advocating for this particular point of view and saying, if we want to bring this to a close, you got to figure out what actually drives your own sentiments and passions and leads to the judgments that you make without expecting all the rest of humanity to go along with those.